Dear colleagues, welcome to today's USA Rice webinar. Thank you for joining us. My name is Esther Somogyi. I am Director of the Europe, Middle East and Africa region at USA Rice, covering all activities from my office based in Hamburg, Germany. We hope that the program we have put together for you today about the global rice trends and in particular the US rice outlook and supply situation will be of interest to you and your business. Before we start with today's presentations, let me please share some housekeeping information with you. The webinar will be recorded and we will share all presentations in a follow-up email with all participants. After each presentation, there will be some time for questions. Also, at the end of the webinar, we will have a general question and answer session where all panelists will be able to answer your questions. In case you want to pose a question, please make sure to use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. Thank you. And now I would like to welcome Betsy Ward, President and CEO of the USA Rice Federation, who many of you have met personally in the past years. A tireless leader committed to building the vision of the US rice industry and supporting trade relationships with our partners all over the world. Betsy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Esther, and good morning, everybody. And thank you for joining us to learn about the current U.S. rice crop and some developments in the rice industry that we think will be interesting to you. I'm Betsy Ward, President and CEO of USA Rice, which is the National Trade Association for the rice industry, with every segment under our umbrella: farmers, millers, merchants, exporters, and end users of rice. We grow and export all types and varieties of rice in the United States, and that rice is primarily grown in 6 states that average about 1 million hectares annually. And just to be clear, all of the rice that is grown here is GMO-free. We have no genetically modified rice in production. But we do have decades of experience in export markets, since we export nearly half of the rice grown each year. We have customers in over 130 countries, from Mexico to Saudi Arabia to Japan. And we do many types of activities in these markets depending on customer preferences and how the markets operate. One particularly successful approach is to work with local importers all over the world to help build and grow their brands that use US rice. And as you can see, we do this in Europe as well. Part of the reason we're here today is because while Europe remains a very important market for us, we also think there is room for growth in that market. And one final point I'd like to make is not only do we have a safe, reliable, high quality product, we also have a sustainable one. Our commitment to sustainability dates back generations. We recently published a comprehensive report that looked at the US rice industry's efforts from 1980 to 2015. As you can see here, our farmers use 52% less water, 34% less energy, resulting in a 41% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, 39% increase in land use efficiency, and a 28% reduction in soil loss. We also have an incredible story to tell about our biodiversity in our rice fields, which provide critical habitat and food for all sorts of animals and birds. I think rice is really unique in this regard. Rice fields provide life-sustaining resources for wildlife, including millions of water birds, reptiles, and amphibians. And more than half of all the North American ducks and waterfowl winter in one of the 3 rice-growing regions of the California Central Valley, the Texas and Louisiana Gulf Coast, and the Mississippi Alluvial Valley. The 3 regions combined support more than 110 species of wildlife. We're very proud of this record and all the key metrics of sustainability, but we know we can't rest on these accomplishments. So the US rice industry recently adopted the sustainability goals for 2030 that you see here. It includes greater improvements in water use, biodiversity, greenhouse gas emissions, and several other key indicators. And because we have such a long history of utilizing conservation programs and improving the environmental footprint around the production and processing of rice, we recently developed a brochure to tell this story to our export customers, to all of you. So this handout is designed to be easily adapted so rice importers and end users can choose relevant statistics from the brochure to use in their own promotions and advertisements. So let's get the webinar going. We have some really excellent speakers today. We want you to come away from this meeting confident in the quality and variety of rice available from the United States. And you should know our farmers are very proud to grow healthy, sustainable, and safe rice for families all over the world. Finally, on a personal note, I have really missed being able to travel and visit with all of you this past year, whether it be to trade shows or to the great rice industry events in Europe like the FIRM Convention, the UK Rice Symposium, but really hope we can visit in person again soon. Thank you all again for taking the time to participate today, and I hope you find some value in this webinar. I'm now going to hand it back to Esther. Thanks again.
Thank you, Betsy, for your welcome and introduction. As you have mentioned, our members are proud to supply healthy, safe, and sustainably produced rice to consumers all over the world. 96% of all rice farms in the USA are family-owned, handing down knowledge and best practices from generation to generation to ensure sufficient land use and an abundant supply. However, US rice production is also strictly regulated by official bodies to ensure the same. Our next speaker, Dr. John Goldberg, will talk about safety and regulatory standards for US rice. Dr. Goldberg is the founder of Science-Based Strategies, a Washington, D.C.-based food, agriculture, and environmental policy consulting firm, and a partner at the Normandy Group. Prior to his move to the private sector, Dr. Goldberg served for 22 years as science advisor to the Committee on Agriculture in the United States House of Representatives. Welcome, Dr. Goldberg. Take it away.
Thank you, Esther. Let me just see if I can get my screen share going. And hopefully you are all seeing my screen now. Is that correct? I'll take that as a yes. All right, well, thank you very much. I was asked to talk a little bit about how pesticides are regulated in the United States. As Esther indicated, I have spent quite a bit of my professional career working in the regulatory and legislative arenas. On the Agriculture Committee, I was responsible for oversight of EPA's pesticide program, as well as legislation or the legislative process leading up to many of the current practices that EPA uses in regulating pesticides. As I begin, I want to emphasize that it's certainly understood that many farmers use pesticides, and this includes both organic as well as synthetic products. Nevertheless, it's important to remember that pesticides are just one tool that we use. It's also important to remember that there is a financial cost associated with pesticide use, so farmers tend to use as little as is necessary. When you consider the cost factor along with the continuing development of more effective and efficient products, more effective delivery mechanisms, as well as improved production practices, it's no wonder that the amount of pesticides being used continues to decline. As I state on this particular slide, USDA data shows a 20% reduction in pesticide use between 1981 and 2008. I suspect that over the previous 12 years, we would follow a similar trend, although I do not have that data available, unfortunately. Equally important for this audience is that upon review of the European Union Rapid Alert System, we find no pesticide residue violations for US rice products going into the European Union. As I mentioned, price is a significant factor encouraging producers to use less pesticides. I also mentioned that many of the newer products that we use are more effective and efficient, enabling farmers to use less. It's also important to highlight that our efforts as an industry to prioritize sustainability as well as food safety have contributed to the reduction in pesticide use. By facilitating enhanced stewardship through our sustainability efforts, the US rice industry has been able to emphasize smarter uses of crop protection tools thereby reducing the risk of residue violations. Beyond the work of the industry to manage pesticide use, it's important to highlight how the United States regulates pesticides, and this will take up the majority of the rest of my presentation. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, regulates pesticide uses under broad authority granted in two major statutes, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, commonly referred to as FIFRA, and the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, referred to by its acronym FFDCA. These laws have been further amended by the Food Quality Protection Act of 1996, as well as the Pesticide Registration and Improvement Act, first authorized in 2003, but reauthorized multiple times. I will note how those laws have impacted the underlying laws shortly. But let me start with FIFRA. FIFRA requires that all pesticides sold, distributed, or used in the United States, including those pesticides imported in the United States, be registered by the Environmental Protection Agency. The registration process, which I'll go to in greater detail a little bit later, is based on an evaluation of the scientific data and assessment of risks and the benefits of the product's use. As part of the registration process, EPA mandates elements of the product label which dictate how the product is to be used. If EPA finds reason to be concerned, EPA can suspend or cancel a product's registration at any time under provisions of FIFRA. The Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, FFDCA, requires EPA to set pesticide tolerances for all pesticides used in or on food or animal feed. A tolerance is the maximum permissible level for a pesticide residue allowed in or on human food or animal feed. In setting these tolerances, FFDCA includes strong provisions for protecting infants and children, as well as other sensitive subpopulations, and I'll go into greater detail about that shortly. I did mention the Food Quality Protection Act of 1996. This was a major reform of the underlying pesticide acts and amended both FIFRA and FFDCA. Regarding the provisions that amended FIFRA, the Food Quality Protection Act established an enhanced safety standard, which requires that the EPA must find a pesticide poses a reasonable certainty of no harm before it can be registered for use on food or feed. FQPA also requires that EPA review each and every pesticide registration at least once every 15 years. This is a re-registration process where the entire file is re-reviewed by EPA, additional data is collected, and the agency determines whether the registration will continue or be changed or be eliminated. FQPA also amended the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act affecting the tolerance setting process. Under this law, several factors must be addressed before a tolerance can be established. And as I indicated, I will be going into more detail on those factors shortly. I mentioned also the Pesticide Registration Improvement Act, which has been reauthorized multiple times. Under this law, a fee-for-service arrangement was established in which the pesticide registrant, the company that is producing the pesticide, must pay a service fee set according to the category of the individual registration action. There's one other law that's critical here, and that's the Endangered Species Act, which requires that every federal agency ensure that any action they authorize, fund, or carry out will not likely jeopardize the continued existence of a listed species or destroy or adversely modify any critical habitat for those species. As part of the pesticide registration process and the periodic reviews of the pesticide registrations, EPA must assess whether the listed or endangered species or their designated critical habitat will be affected by the use of the pesticide product. The statutes I discussed in the previous slide lay out the processes and requirements for pesticide registration. I do want to emphasize that any product manufactured, sold, or used in the United States that claims to have a pesticidal effect, and this includes not only herbicides, fungicides, rodenticides, insecticides, but it also includes antimicrobials and antiviral disinfectants, such as what we're all using on our hands lately to deal with the COVID pandemic. Each of these products must be registered by EPA as a pesticide. It is unlawful to sell, distribute, or use a pesticide in the United States that has not first been approved by the Environmental Protection Agency. So let me go into a little bit more detail about the registration process. As I indicated earlier, pesticide registration is a scientific, legal, and administrative procedure through which the EPA examines a number of factors, including the ingredients of the pesticide, the particular site or crop where the pesticide will be used, the amount, frequency, and timing of pesticide use, as well as storage and disposal practices. In evaluating the pesticide registration application, EPA assesses a wide variety of potential human health and environmental effects associated with the proposed use of the product. Any company that wants to produce a pesticide must provide data from studies that comply with all EPA testing guidelines. And in fact, the minimum data requirement for EPA is typically 127 different studies. And that's, as I said, the minimum. Some pesticide application processes require significantly more data. Companies must submit an application for the registration action, such as to register a new pesticide, active ingredient, a new product for an existing pesticide, and by new product, I mean a new crop use, or added new use, other new uses associated with the product. The company's application must include many items, including the identity and quantity of the chemicals in the product, data on the potential risks to human health and the environment, including the potential for pesticide residues on food, if applicable, and the labeling, including directions for use, contents, and the appropriate warnings for those uses. EPA ensures full transparency throughout this process, starting with publication of the notice of receipt of the application in the Federal Register, which is the diary of US government activities published every day. As you can imagine, this is a process that takes a considerable amount of time as well as a considerable cost. On average, it takes between 6 and 9 years to register a pesticide in the United States. The cost is estimated to exceed $250 million for each pesticide application. Let me talk a little bit more about the evaluation process that EPA goes through. As part of their evaluation, the agency assesses human health risks associated with pesticide use, including the risks associated with sensitive subgroups, such as children, immune suppressed individuals, etc. As part of the assessment, the agency will review data on the aggregate risks associated with an individual pesticide use, that is all the individual uses of the specific pesticide, whether it's through food, water, or residential use. They'll also look at the cumulative risks from different pesticides with a similar mode of activity. Likewise, they will review the occupational risks to those applying the pesticide during their work, such as farm workers, folks who work in manufacturing facilities where they will fumigate the facility, etc. EPA will also assess the environmental risks by reviewing data on the potential for groundwater contamination. They will evaluate the risks to endangered and threatened species. They will also look at the potential for endocrine disruption effects. The process EPA uses is a risk assessment process. They use this for evaluating the potential for health and ecological effects of the pesticide. EPA will review all of the scientific data on the pesticide product and develop a comprehensive risk assessment that will examine the potential effects of the product or ingredient on the human population and the environment. These effects include harm to humans, wildlife, fish, and plants, including endangered species and non-target organisms. They'll evaluate the potential for contamination of surface water or groundwater from leaching, runoff, and/or spray drift of the pesticide. They will also look at the potential human risks ranging from short-term toxicity to long-term effects such as cancer or reproductive system disorders. As this is a risk assessment process, EPA evaluates whether the presence of a potential hazard can be mitigated through use restrictions. As the process moves forward, EPA will then evaluate and possibly approve language that appears on each pesticide label to ensure the directions for use and the safety measures as appropriate are applied to address any of the potential risks that were identified. All of this that EPA does is not a static process. They often consult scientific experts as part of their process. And in fact, every individual decision of the agency goes through a scientific peer review process. EPA will then make risk management and regulatory decisions where the agency will consider the results of the risk assessments and the peer review. They will research alternative pesticides that are already registered before making a decision on a new product. They will also review any measures needed to mitigate any identified risks, as I suggested earlier. At the end of this process, the EPA will publish another Federal Register notice outlining the issuance of the pesticide registration and seek public comment on those decisions. As I indicated, registration is just one regulatory process that the EPA must go through. If a pesticide will be used on food or animal feed, then the EPA must also establish a tolerance for each crop use of a pesticide after developing another risk assessment. For that risk assessment, they will consider, as I indicated earlier, the aggregate exposure through diet and drinking water from the pesticide use in or around a person's home. They will assess the cumulative effects of exposure to pesticides that have a common mechanism of toxicity. They will assess whether there is an increased susceptibility to infants and children or other sensitive subpopulations. They will also assess whether the pesticide produces an effect in people similar to an effect produced by a naturally occurring estrogen or produces other endocrine disruption effects. Some risk assessments that EPA will conduct will use the assumption that the residues will always be present in food at the maximum level permitted by the tolerance. In other cases where data exists, the agency will assess risks based on the actual or anticipated residue data to affect real-world consumer exposure as closely as possible. Let me move on here. As I indicated earlier, throughout this process, EPA will ultimately, if they choose to register the product, they will also review and approve the language that goes on the pesticide label. The means by which the pesticide is authorized to be sold, distributed, or used in the United States through EPA's approval is that label. And it is important to note in the United States, the label is the law. EPA reviews pesticide product labels as part of the registration process and must approve all label language before the pesticide can be sold or distributed. The overall intent of the label is to provide clear directions for effective product performance while minimizing risks to human health and the environment. And as I suggested, the label is the law. It is a violation of federal law in the United States to use any pesticide in a manner inconsistent with that product label. I'd now like to turn to some of the international issues that we are tracking. Most notably, the issue of how pesticide residues are regulated in international commerce. Throughout this presentation, I've used the term tolerance to describe the maximum residue level allowed on food or feed in the United States. In international commerce, you are all probably very familiar that we simply refer to that maximum residue level or MRL. Agricultural organizations in the United States are unsurprisingly concerned with low or missing MRLs in the countries we export to. This concern has been raised to our executive branch, and following receipt of a request from the United States Trade Representative's Office on August 30th, 2019, the U.S. International Trade Commission instituted an investigation addressing the global economic impact of missing or low pesticide MRLs. As part of USTR's request, they asked 8 questions. All of this is available on the ITC website if you'd like to look at those. The first 6 questions were addressed in the first volume of the USITC's investigation, and that volume was released in June of 2020. The last 2 questions are the subject of volume 2, which we anticipate will be released sometime this winter. The first volume of the ITC report is available on the Commission website and provides very useful background information. I'm assuming either Esther or Sarah, when we send out the presentations, we can include a link to the ITC investigation volume 1. Among the Commission's findings in volume 1, unsurprisingly, was that low MRLs, including missing MRLs in import markets, deter or reduce trade. Studies find that trade reducing effects of these non-tariff barriers including measures imposing fixed or recurring costs on exporters I'm sorry, I got a little tongue-tied. So the effect that ITC found was that these non-tariff trade barriers do include measures that impose fixed or recurring costs on exporters, which in turn cause certain exporters to forego or reduce trade rather than incur these additional costs. These costs and effects may be compounded to the extent that exporters must diversify production practices in order to meet different requirements in different markets, providing potential advantages to larger firms capable of maintaining differentiated production at the expense of the smaller firms that may be less adaptable. There are no doubt different laws in different countries with different approaches and different standards for pesticide regulation in those markets. We obviously, as an industry that exports, we are cognizant of these different requirements and do everything we can to meet them. The costs and effects of legal compliance with these standards may be compounded to the extent that exporters must diversify production practices in order to meet these requirements, as I said earlier. And as I suggested, larger firms may be more capable of dealing with these differences than smaller firms, which provides an advantage to those larger operations. One way to deal with the complexity of the regulatory mechanisms of different countries is through the development of non-binding international guidelines through codex. There are many national authorities that rely on codex MRLs for pesticide residues to be permissible on that commodity. The Codex Committee on Pesticide Residues is responsible for establishing Codex MRLs for pesticide residues in specific food items or in groups of food. Before a Codex MRL can be established, the human health risk assessments must be conducted to ensure that the food supply is safe. It is the responsibility of the Joint Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, as well as the World Health Organization, meeting on pesticide residues to review the appropriate toxicology and residue field trial data, to conduct those dietary risk assessments, as well as to recommend specific MRLs to the Codex Committee on Pesticide Residues. As you can imagine, the United States is an active participant in this process. Once the US delegation to Codex is informed that there is a need to establish a specific Codex MRL, the delegation will then work with not only the registrants of the pesticide, but also the Interregional Research Project number 4, referred to as IR4, which tends to produce a lot of data related to minor uses of pesticides. And through this process, they'll determine if there are sufficient data available to submit for review to Codex. If the data are available, the US delegation will nominate a chemical so that it can be scheduled for a review. Once that review is conducted, provided that there are no issues of concern, Codex will consider the establishment of the MRL. As it currently exists, the Codex process is scientifically sound and a reliable source for setting MRLs, and it is certainly our hope that the scientific underpinnings of this process are fully maintained. I've said an awful lot, so let me summarize with 4 points. First is that the judicious use of pesticides offers tremendous benefits to both the growers and consumers. US rice exporters work hard to ensure we meet US Codex and destination country standards. The differences between countries regarding pesticide residue standards certainly create challenges. And finally, the reliance on science-based risk assessments can aid in international harmonization of food safety standards. With that, Esther, I think I have said quite a bit, and I will turn it back to you to see if there are any questions that I can answer. Did I say in my 25 minutes?
Thank you, Dr. Goldberg, for this very informative presentation. And now I would like to open up for any questions. Please make sure to use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen.
And I guess I will stop sharing my screen now.
So here is our first question. Do current EPA regulations in the USA match comply with all MRLs set by EU, UK for rice? Dr. Goldberg.
So the US establishes its tolerances for pesticides. We are certainly cognizant of the Codex standards. And during EPA's review, they will take into account the Codex standard. As you can imagine, the products that are used in the United States may differ with the products used overseas, and therefore there may not be a Codex standard for some of the products that we use. Likewise, there may not be a Codex standard for some of the products used in the European Union. We are certainly aware of differences in the residue, the maximum residue levels in certain countries, and where there is a difference between the US level and the importing country level, our growers will take every possible precaution to ensure that we meet those standards. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Dr. Goldberg. Here comes our next question from Ben Savage in the UK. Are US producers and exporters able to offer rice that is compliant to EU requirement? Is this done by managing the inputs at farm level or just be testing lots before shipment?
I think it's all of the above. Certainly, if we're aware of the standard, we will do everything we can to meet the standard. We do that, as the questioner suggests, not only through our production practices, the the sourcing of the rice into the rice mills, the testing of the product before it leaves the farm, as it arrives in the milling operation, and before it leaves the milling operation. But we are also aware that the importing countries will do compliance testing as well. And as you can imagine, it costs an awful lot to ship product across the Atlantic or Pacific. When we do so, if the product is detained or returned, that's additional costs. Nobody wants to bear those costs, so we do everything we can to avoid any residue violations.
Thank you for your answer, Dr. Goldberg. I would suggest that thank you for all the questions. We could not discuss all of them at this point in time, but we will make sure to cover these at the end of the webinar. So please do not worry. I would suggest now that we continue with our next speaker, Dr. Nathan Childs. He will give us an overview of the world rice market situation and trends, followed by US supply information on recently harvested US rice crop. Dr. Childs is an agriculture economist at the United States Department of Agriculture Economic Research Service since 1987. During his career, he has worked on a variety of topics, and currently he is managing ERS contribution to the Rice Outlook Situation and Outlook program. Dr. Childs, thank you for being here with us today. We look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you, Esther. I'm delighted to be here and delighted to have a chance to talk about the U.S. and global rice market outlook. I'll go to my slides now and I'll give a presentation. The first thing I'll go with, just present the title. We're going to look at global rice trade is expected to increase in 2021, and production and stocks are projected to be record high. My first slide, I'm just going to go over some main points, and then we'll mostly look at charts and charts and figures. Looking at record production in South Asia. That's the largest rice producing region in the world is South Asia. Stable productions for East Asia. That's the second largest rice growing region. It's almost as big as South Asia. South Asia is just a little larger. It's stable, not record, and some crop recovery in Southeast Asia. Some crop recovery also expected for the U.S. And since that U.S. crop is virtually in, it's hardly forecasted anymore. That crop is almost all in, not quite, but almost. Global consumption and residual use is projected at a record high. China accounts for almost all of the increase, with India's domestic use remaining at a very high record level. And most of that's the increase in India's domestic use is due to the pandemic-related food relief program, which subsidized wheat and rice to about 800 million people. And that has boosted India's consumption in 1920 to about a record 106 million tons, staying about the same in 2021. Global trade expected to increase about 3% to about 44 million tons from 2020. Both India and Thailand are expected to increase exports in 21. Now, I want to let you know that world trade is still below the 17 record of about 48 million tons. So some recovery from the pandemic level, but it's not a record. Exportable supplies in the Southern South America area or Mercosur region are expected to remain extremely tight. They are extremely tight, and they will remain tight until harvest in 2021. And that supports expanding U.S. exports to that region, and also means less competition for U.S. exports in other Latin American markets. Global ending stocks in 2021, a record high, about 179 million tons, and the 14th consecutive year of increasing global stocks. U.S. stocks are expected to increase as well. Rebound, actually 1920 were very low, so U.S. stocks are expected to rebound. Looking at this figure, total rice supplies in 2021 are expected to be record high, a record carry-in, and a record crop. And you can see on the chart that Global stocks were quite high at the turn of the century. They dropped for a few years, almost all driven by China. They've been on a steady growth since. Production's not record high every year, though. Back in 1516, El Nino cut global production quite a lot. Record production, record carry-in. We'll look at some maps and some weather issues. This is China, of course. China's projected to have a bumper crop, not a record, but about 147 million tons, down a little over 1 million tons from record. But it had severe flooding July, August, and then got hit with typhoons August, September. Now, the southeast was struck first. That's the Yangtze River Valley. There was heavy rain really in June. And then July, August, the flooding spread east and west, and that's at southeast China. Hurricane Mazak comes in northeast China. The first crop area expanded. That was due to policy, wanted more area. Not first crop, the early crop in China. It's an early indica crop, but the yield was hurt by the heavy flooding. Some of the flooding was record, other was near record. It's heavily around that Yangtze River Valley. Still a pretty good crop expected for China, but not record. I want to look at the two largest producers, China, India. No other country are even close. These are the biggest producers by far. China's crop, a good crop, about 147 million tons, a little bit below record. 1718 was record, about a little over 148. Down a little from record. Area is up some, which is somewhat of a change. China's area had been drifting down. Policy was supporting production at a lower level, a little bit less, but area went up slightly this year, not much. India, 5th consecutive year of a record crop. Area is up sharply in 2021. The monsoon was very favorable. India's had the monsoons have not been all favorable the last 5 years, but it has not been a really bad monsoon. India's had record crops. This is the 5th consecutive year, about 120 million tons milled basis. A lot of rice. India's stocks are record high. China's stocks are record high. Looking at some more weather maps. This is Southeast Asia, both mainland and islands. 1920, which this is not showing, this is this year, but 1920 had a severe drought in the region. The rainy season in 1920 started late, ended early. Reservoirs were not replenished. Thailand had a weak crop. Burma's crop was impacted. Mekong River levels were low. This is 20. Initially, the rainy season was weak. This is what it's showing. This is June 1. That's about rainy season really started a little before that, but August 30th, we're still in the rainy season. It was a little weak. You can see parts of Vietnam, not all of Vietnam were weak. Cambodia, Burma, watch Burma especially, Laos, parts of Laos. Then in September, the rains improved. Again, Southeast Asia, I'm focusing on the mainland. Southern Vietnam, that's Mekong River Delta, parts of North Vietnam, parts of Cambodia did receive rainfall. Parts of Burma are still a little weak, especially the Burma Delta, where the bulk of Burma's rice crop is produced. Now remember, the mainland countries of Southeast Asia are mostly exporters, except for Laos, which doesn't export or import much rice. The other countries on the mainland are exporters. Now, this presentation is based on the October WASDE release. But in October, there was quite a lot of rainfall. This map, this ends the end of September, in Vietnam especially. Very heavy rainfall, Hanoi, which is in the north, of course. Other areas of Southeast Asia, especially around Vietnam or Cambodia, extremely heavy rainfall, landslides, typhoons. Those will be factored in, of course, the November analysis. I'm looking at Thailand and Vietnam. Two exporters, number 2, number 3. Thailand's crop is expected to partially recover, but not a full recovery. You can see that it's still down from 1819. Go back to 1516, drought. Vietnam's crop remains below record. It's actually drifting down. Vietnam's area is drifting down. It's not plummeting, but it's dropping a little bit each year. There's diversification of cropland, there's saltwater intrusion. This year, I moved through it rather quickly, but the rainfall early in the rainy season was below normal. So Vietnam drifting down. 2 exporters, large exporters. I'm going to look at other countries, not necessarily the next largest. There are other producers that are larger I'm not looking at. I just wanted to show you we've got Burma, some recovery. Remember, Burma got harmed, crop was harmed by drought. Cambodia, not much change. Philippines coming down. That's really due to area. And, you know, Philippines has opened its country up to more imports. It's rice tariffication policies. It's now open to private imports. And Philippines can import rice at a lower price than it produces it. So production is drifting down a little. Laos, the red for Laos was severe flooding. Pakistan, an exporter in South Asia, has a record crop. These are milled basis. Obviously, divided by the milling rates, you could look at it on a rough basis. As you can see, Burma and Cambodia's crops have a hard time really increasing a whole lot, but some recovery. The Western Hemisphere, these are the 2 largest producers in the Western Hemisphere by a massive margin. No one else is close to Brazil and the US. For Brazil, we expect production to drop just a little bit. It's really due to a more normal yield. Area is actually supposed to be up in 2021. In 1920, it was a record yield for Brazil by a huge margin, but the area was the lowest since about 1929. And area in Brazil has been on a decline since the mid-1970s. That's not every year, but a pretty steady decline. It's that upland, dry land, low yielding rice. Most rice in Brazil grown in Rio Grande do Sul. United States expected crop recovery from last year's flooding in the Delta. There was rain in the Delta again this year that delayed production, but not to the degree of 1920, which had record preventive plantings. Looking now at trade, away from production, just show you a chart. Trade is projected up about 3%, not record. You can see Sub-Saharan Africa remains the largest importing region. And if you just look, go back to 2000, the beginning of the century, look how much Sub-Saharan Africa's rice imports have increased. Look at Asia. Well, Asia has increased, but not as much as Sub-Saharan Africa. So Sub-Saharan Africa is really driving global rice trade. Its imports are increasing, consumption increasing, and production. Now over 1 billion people live in Sub-Saharan Africa. It's a major factor in global rice trade. And people have asked us, global rice trade is a little bit less than 9% of production. 30 years ago, it was about 4%. Move on to look at exporters. These are the top 4, and no one else is close to their level. India is expected to remain number 1 with increase in exports. India overtook Thailand in 2012. Thailand had been the number 1 for well over 2 decades, probably 3 decades. Thailand's exports are expected to again remain weak. Thailand was non-price competitive. Now, recently, Thailand's prices have dropped a lot and Vietnam's have risen. But Thailand's prices were probably $100 higher, well over that, than India. India has plenty of rice, very price competitive. That includes the basmati rice as well. That's coarse rice and basmati. Thailand ships many types of rice: jasmine, glutinous, broken, regular milled white rice. Vietnam, some fragment rice also. As you can see, Vietnam's exports, they were doing in the 7s. They're drifting down. Again, their crop is drifting down. You just don't see their exports going up. They're down around 6.3-ish. They've been well over 7. Pakistan stays around 4. Hard for Pakistan to move much above 4 million tons. Looking at the next 4 largest global rice exporters, US, China, Burma. USA is rather stable, around 3 million, maybe slightly above. It's nowhere near record. The US has done like 3.5 in the past. Remember that Turkey used to be a major buyer. Libya was a major buyer. This year, Brazil has already come in for almost well over about 115,000 tons for sure. I haven't checked this morning's export sales. Brazil normally doesn't buy any rice from the U.S. It's been, I think, well over about a decade since Brazil came in. Brazil's in for that's rough rice. Iraq has not come in yet. That forecast would assume some purchases by Iraq. China's exports are increasing. they kind of level off here, but at a high level. They're still below record. China exported about 3.7 million tons in 98. China has been increasing its exports about the last 5 years, medium grain and long grain. Burma's sort of drifting down. Burma had been the largest exporter before 1941, exporting around 3.5 million tons, which was a lot of rice then. It's still a lot of rice. Maybe 10, 12 years ago, it started to pick it back up again, but it hasn't really, it's just not moving back to that 3.5 record. Cambodia was out of the export market 30 years, but having a hard time, getting even up to 1.5 million. But Cambodia did nothing for over 30 years. We'll look at importers now. Now, this is interesting. The US and China are both exporters and importers. This is China and the Philippines. China's an exporter and an importer. These are the two largest importers. You can see China imports, they're drifting down. They had a record of about almost 6 million. I think it's 5.7 and 17. By the way, China has huge stocks. It's importing for quality, for price, maybe for security, but in food security, but they have plenty of rice. China has huge stocks of rice. Imports are drifting down. Most imports are from local countries that are Southeast Asia and Pakistan. Philippines is probably the largest rice importer in the world now. Imports are expected to be up just a little bit. It's new import policy allowing private imports. Philippines can import rice, lower costs and produce rice. Imports are not record high. The Philippines relies on imports more than most Asian countries. Imports for Bangladesh, Indonesia are a much smaller share of consumption than for the Philippines. And the Philippines just remains, the term dependent on well over 1 million tons, probably close to 2 million tons of rice. 2 million, even though it's well over that now, 2.6. Looking at some other major buyers, this is sort of a mixture. The reason I put the EU in here is EU is at absolute record rice imports. They're just importing a lot of rice, like the United States. EU's at record imports, record consumption. Nigeria, sometimes the largest importer, down around 1.2 million tons. Record production, foreign exchange limitations, border measures. Nigeria, sometimes 3 million tons of rice. Saudi Arabia grows no rice. It's just driven by consumption, guest workers. Iran normally is in for 1.5 million tons. Iran produces a lot of rice. In fact, it produces more rice than it imports, but it's still dependent on imports. UAE, massive increase in imports, about 1.2, 1.3 million tons. That's a huge amount of rice. Go back again to the Western Hemisphere. Brazil and the US, both import, both export. This is just imports. Brazil's imports in 2020 were the highest since 2003. We know their supplies got tight. Brazil exported a lot of rice early in the year. Its crop has been declining, so it's importing a lot. We expect imports to remain fairly strong in 21. We don't see Brazil's production really going back up. We just don't see land going back into rice at all in Brazil. It's a high cost crop compared to, say, soybeans, and rice can be imported at a lower price than it can be grown. So except for Rio Grande do Sul, it'll probably remain in that southeast. I want to show you the US, and I said one point, I specifically said Nigeria and the US imports are about the same. If I said that a few years ago, no one would have believed it. Nigeria was 3 million tons. The US imports absolutely soared. Monthly imports sometimes were 130,000 tons. They've drifted back down a little bit in August, September. But we still see US rice imports at almost record, almost record. I want to look at the Southern South American exporters, Mercosur. This is just the exporters and their stocks. And what I wanted to show you, you can see to the right just how low the stocks are in those countries. And they're basically, now Brazil is an importer also, but Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay are exporters. They're really about out of exportable supplies until next harvest, but we still expect tight supplies. That means US rice can move into those markets. Globally, Rice stocks are record 179 million tons, up from 177. You can see China's 65%, India's 18% of global stocks. If you took those two countries out and just looked at that black bar, stocks haven't changed much at all. So you can see India's at record, China's at record stocks. Just a look at the US, we're not going to spend that much time on it. It was a 21% increase in harvested area from a weather-reduced level last year, boosted the crop 23%. It's a little over 10 million tons on a rough basis. Now, on a mill basis, it would be around 0.7 of that. All of the growth is long grain. Asian aromatic imports are expected to remain at record or almost record levels. That's mostly jasmine, also the basmati. China is expected to continue to supply rice to Puerto Rico. 3, maximum 4 shipments. 3 is more likely, but possibly 4 of around 21,000 tons each. Long grain exports are expected to increase. That's due to more competitive prices, larger supplies. Rough rice, and most of the rough rice is long grain, by the way, will go to Latin America. And again, that's sort of based on the increase. The big increase is that the South American exporters are out of exportable supplies. Most of the US rough rice goes to Latin America. Most of it's long grain, but by absolute huge margin. There's some medium grain that goes to Libya and Turkey in some years. That's been very weak recently. US consumption and residual use are projected at record high, larger supplies, and the record imports. Remember, the imports are imported to be consumed, so if they're going up a lot, that's likely means consumption's going up, and imports went up a lot. Ending stocks projected to increase almost 2/3 to over 2 million tons on a rough basis. That's a rough basis now, with long grain accounting for most of the buildup. Well, remember, long grain stocks plummeted in 1920 to extremely low levels. In fact, the US virtually ran out of rice. They didn't have California rice to sell either. By that June, July period, with some of the weakest export sales on record. And then the census exports, even August, September, have shown that the US was just out of rice to sell for a short period. New harvest virtually in. Just show you a few charts. This is US rice on a rough basis. You can see that the area goes up about 21%, big boost in production, nowhere near record production or record area. Record area was 81, second record was 2010, record crop 2010. There's just no projections at record production or record area in the foreseeable future. I want to show you the exports. You can see, exports certainly not trending up, maybe somewhat stabilized. I mean, a little bit of growth, some small growth. The rough rice are up quite a bit projected. That's Latin America. Milled rice are about the same. That does assume sales to Iraq. Somewhat in the past years, if you recall, some of the rough rice, Venezuela was taking somewhat more. Going back farther, Turkey was taking some more. That's nowhere near record, but we expect a boost in the rough rice. I want to show you the long grain ending stocks. I just see that really low number for 1920. Those were really low stocks to use ratio, virtually out of rice. Expect a big recovery. Well, most of that crop's already in, so I mean, we should have those supplies. And the reports from NASS, the monthly crop reports, indicated a strong rebound in the southern long grain. Although it reports almost all long grains going to the south. Summary: record global supplies led by a bumper crop in South Asia, some crop recovery in Southeast Asia, and a larger U.S. crop. Global consumption residual use expected to be record high. Most of the increase is China. China's the only big increase, and India remaining at a very high record. Global trade expected to recover from some of the pandemic limited level, but not record. Exportable supplies in Mercosur tight, opening up markets for U.S. exports. Already seen with Brazil, And global ending stocks are projected to be record high again. I thank you, and I'm open for any questions, thoughts, or views. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Childs. It was a very informative presentation. Now I would like to open up the floor for any questions. We have already a few of them coming in. John Calland, thank you very much for the question. I will save this one for the end of the webinar for the general Q&A session. And I have another question here from John Hesbrook from Sunwest Foods, California. And I will put this question to Nathan. He's asking, what is the approximate breakdown by variety for US rice imports to the EU?
Okay, right. Now the US exports to the EU, I'm sure. Are you talking about the EU imports of rice? It's heavily Indian, I believe. The US ships a very small amount to the EU, maybe 55,000 tons. It's probably not more than that. 55, 60 would be max. It's heavily India rice. It takes a lot of basmati rice. Thailand ships some rice. EU is 2.3 million at least. I think that's, I'm rounding. I'm not looking at my chart, but it's a record. It's up from a year ago. Heavily the basmati. Remember, the EU heavily grows the medium grain. It grows long grain as well. But I'm going to say the bulk of it is going to be a lot of it from India, Pakistan, the basmati rice. They would be the main sources. Again, the US would be a supplier of maybe 55,000 tons. And it doesn't seem to be growing. It stays right around 55, 56,000 tons. I'm counting, by the way, that would count the EU, UK. I'm sort of counting them both. And by the way, the UK is one of the almost every year is the largest of the buyers of the Western Europe. At one time, the US exported well over 250,000 tons to the EU, but that's been maybe 14, 15 years. So for the EU, it's heavily the Asian rice. A lot of it's the fragrant rice. It's a big market, growing.
Thank you very much, Dr.
I can get more detail on that.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Here comes the next question from Milo Hamilton. Could the dry weather and very low reservoir in Mercosur lead to rice acreage abandonment in this area this fall?
Right, yeah. We're looking at those planting, we're right in it now. We're still, I can't go beyond the our October WASDE. The supplies are very tight. You would think that area, markets would indicate area would expand with really tight supplies. Now, of course, those supplies won't be available till 21, the spring, March at the earliest, probably more April, some even later than that, May. All that's irrigated. It's modern, high yield. Almost all of that, Uruguay, Paraguay, Rio Grande do Sul is high, or it's going to be irrigated. We haven't looked at that. We're not showing. Remember, at this stage, it's hard to factor in weather problems. It's a little early, but it's worth looking at because we are assuming that by 21, March, April, the supplies in the Southern South America will increase quite a bit. And of course, that rice will go into export markets rather rapidly, and the US will face far more competition. So that's something to watch. This is planting now in that region.
Thank you, Dr. Childs. Thank you very much for these great questions. I would like to continue now with our program. And if there are any questions which we couldn't answer now, we will just answer them at the end of the webinar. So please stay with us. And now let me please welcome Dr. Jarrod Hardke, Rice Extension Agronomist from the University of Arkansas. Dr. Hardke leads the development of production recommendations for rice production in Arkansas and will share information on the Arkansas rice crop. Arkansas is the largest rice producing state in the USA, covering about 40% of the entire US rice production. Rice research stations are continuously working on developing high quality and sustainable rice varieties that are appreciated by consumers both in the US as well as abroad, using only traditional breeding methods. Dr. Hardke, the floor is yours.
thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
excellent. Thank you. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Are you able to see those slides okay?
Not yet.
Oh, well, let's try that one more time.
Thank you.
That should do it.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that introduction. And again, thank you for having me this morning. Happy to be here to talk a little bit about Arkansas rice production in 2020, as well as looking forward to 2021. A few comments on acreage and cultivars for today. I certainly want to take a moment. In my opinion, it always helps to define a little bit about where we're talking about in the state of Arkansas, located in the western portion, kind of the southeast, right in the middle in the general mid-south area. Arkansas, of course, outlined, and then really the majority of the rice producing area occurs in the Arkansas, what we call the Arkansas Delta, but it's in the Mississippi River Basin there, the area shaded in white. That is where the majority of rice production does occur within the state of Arkansas. And certainly we'll get to the other areas as well, but that production region, in addition to Arkansas, does extend to the Boot Hill of Missouri, the very southeastern portion of Missouri, circled there, certainly down through, again, continuing into Louisiana in the northeastern portion. Significant increase recently in rice acres there, and then of course Southwest Louisiana and the Texas Gulf Coast being the other major regions in the South and Gulf, and of course California, which will be addressed more here later. So within the state of Arkansas, as far as where we produce rice, you can see some different shading in the colors here just to assist, and these would be the different counties within the state. So one of our traditional areas of production being what's referred to, and many are familiar with, the Grand Prairie region of the state, which is primarily within these three counties shaded in blue, as well as portions of these others, just edges. That the prairie region doesn't necessarily follow the county lines, but that is the majority of that region. A lot of rice production occurs in those three counties, and those three counties in that Grand Prairie region do represent annually the highest average rice yields in the state. In terms of the orange area to the northeast, this is what's really typically known as our White River production area. The White River runs through this area, and well, some other river systems, but this has now moved to being where the majority of our rice is produced. For those of you not familiar, our interstate system, large interstate highway, runs about roughly halfway, kind of creates a halfway dividing point in the eastern half of the state, and essentially 2/3 of our production occurs north of that line, and it kind of cuts across Lonoke and Prairie counties there, all the way over to Tennessee. But that White River production area, again, large number of our acres. And the green colored area represents what we refer to as more of our Delta area, which is characterized by heavier clay soils. Again, very good rice ground, a lot flatter, those heavier, increased water holding capacity soils versus the silt loam, lighter textured soil, still excellent rice ground, but different problems and positives with those in these other areas. And within that, again, speaking to the area and number of acres, not to get too deep in the actual numbers, but when you look strictly at the number of acres and where the majority of rice is grown, you can see the top 5 counties within the state of Arkansas for production, being Poinsett, Jackson, and Cross in the northeast, and then Arkansas and Lonoke counties within the Grand Prairie area. And again, a lot of areas still significant production, Lawrence, Jefferson, and some others scattered around. So very, very robust and diverse region. And then we have what's referred to as the River Valley area to the west, a lot smaller production, but scattered along the Arkansas River. and then down some other river systems to the southwest towards Texas. So again, very, very diverse systems. As already been mentioned to a degree, we're from a total acreage standpoint, roughly 1.45 million acres of total rice, both long and medium grain, produced in 2020. You can see that for the past roughly 8 to 10 years, we have been on this up and down cycle, driven by many factors, rotation with other crops. We do rotate primarily with soybean. 75 to 80% of our rice is in a 1-to-1 rotation with soybean. We do also rotate some with corn and cotton as well, but commodity prices also do play a role in dictating how this balance works out. And certainly planting conditions do have an impact each year annually, and that actually did occur in the past couple of years, and even in 2019 there, where intentions were arguably much higher, but wet conditions did not allow. But compared to 2019, we did see a 25% overall acreage increase just in the state of Arkansas, and again saw large increases throughout the Mid-South in Missouri, Mississippi, and Louisiana as well. Our state average yields have been largely excellent since about 2012. We set a yield record then, which we immediately surpassed in 2013 and 2014. Had a few, we'll say, rougher years in between, and then now in the past several years, despite some difficult but variable production conditions, overall production has been very good, with an expected yield of almost 167 bushels per acre, or 7,500 pounds per acre. Harvested acreage by type, the state of Arkansas is still very, very heavy in terms of long grain production. The yellow portion of the bar referring to long grain, and the blue portion referring to medium grain. So certainly there are years where we do achieve close to or even exceed 20% of our planted acres in medium grain. But the majority of the time, we typically say 10 to 15% of the Arkansas crop is medium grain, and that trend again seems to continue. And this year did drop off a little bit more than expected for total, with a pretty big long grain increase in 2020. Some weather impacts on the 2020 crop. Just to touch a little bit, a couple of locations to point out. When you look at the darker predominant line through the middle of the graph, this would be the long-term average accumulated rainfall for Stuttgart, Arkansas, which is located in the southeastern portion of the state. And you can see how from the very beginning, how much higher we were than average in total rainfall accumulated. And that has, again, continued very, very late into October. And the same was similarly true for Jonesboro, which is located in the northeastern portion of the state, where you saw us get very ahead of annual rainfall averages and stay that way. And one of the driving points to make from this, because it does look like we got ahead of the average and then stayed largely on track with it once we got ahead. But the notable thing is the repeated and continuous ripples within actual measured rainfall amounts that made it very, very difficult throughout the early planting season through March, April, and May, where these repeated rainfall events made planting extremely difficult, and everything was done in very short bursts of just 2 to 3 working days at a time, which is very difficult to get on a run and plant. Whereas you can see we got a little bit later into the summer and had some more prolonged gaps between rainfall events. But of course, that time we were in the middle of growing the crop rather than planting. Overall planting progress, which you can note by the yellow line for 2020 and the black line for 2019. There's 2018 in green for reference, which was a moderate pace in 2018, and how slow 2019 and 2020 both were. Both of these were roughly the slowest planting progress in 30 plus years, going back to the early 90s. So it'd been a long time since we'd been pushed as late as we were those 2 years. And certainly in comparison with some of our earliest planted years, some of our moderate, again, within any type of recent years, not going back as far as 30, just how slow things did progress. And when you look at things from a harvest progress standpoint, you can see that we, given the harvest conditions this year, and really the way temperatures fell out later in as we entered the harvest season, we're even substantially behind 2019 progress in terms of harvest and getting the crop out. Which it was mentioned, we're most of the way now with the graph. You can add a couple more weeks to when this graph was made. We're at roughly 95% harvested now, so very near the end. But again, tracking very much behind. So been a difficult year from a production standpoint. A few comments on changing sustainability practices for our producers, and this is based on a survey of our county extension agents from all of our rice producing counties over really the past almost 20 years, and a few differences in what our growers are attempting to do. So when you see the yellow bar and the comment of conventional, so conventional tillage would be what you would think of with us preparing the soil for planting, and then some additional tillage passes at planting when we're putting the seed in the ground. And instead, there's been more of a transition toward a stale seed bed approach, in which once that seed bed is prepared, you really don't do anything to it again. You just plant directly into that prepared seed bed. There's been a lot of reasons for that, and things that have aided in us making that move. But you can see the increase in those blue bars, and even more dramatic increases in these recent years, which have also been driven somewhat by conditions. And there's always been an interest in no-till planting into ground without any tillage prior to that. So again, that's reducing our footprint dramatically, moving toward more stale and no-till seedbed, just trying to get the crop planted. Irrigation methods, certainly when everyone thinks of rice, they do think of a flooded environment. We are somewhat unique to other areas of the world in that in the Mid-South, we do predominantly practice a dry seeded delayed flood method, where we're not actually flooding our fields, the majority of them, until early seedling stages, around the B5 stage. And from that point on, largely holding the flood through the end of the growing season, and then draining for harvest. But you can see from those yellow bars this downward trend in just a traditional cascade flood, where we're actually allowing water to spill through levee gates, or water move through spills. Some refer to them just as spills. And you can see an increase in these blue bars referred to as MIRI, multiple inlet rice irrigation. We're actually using poly tubing to put equal amounts of water in every paddy at the same time. We see increases in efficiency from a wide range of areas, but particularly even from water use, efficiency goes up, and we can see 30% or more water savings when that's used properly. And that's been going on for some time. Again, not all fields are suited for that. So we're not ever going to see all fields with that multiple inlet irrigation technique, but there has been additional increase in the last few years in AWD, which is alternate wetting and drying, or intermittent flooding, and particularly in furrow irrigated rice, sometimes referred to as row rice, as you look at the white bars at the bottom steadily increasing, and where we expect in 2020 it could be as much as 14% of Arkansas's total acreage, where we are growing rice in more of an upland fashion, irrigating down furrows, not actually flooding the crop, and growing it a little bit more like irrigated soybean, corn, or cotton in that fashion. And again, getting away from a flooded environment. That can have some water savings, not always, but it is, again, a more efficient system, and can reduce a lot of passes across the field, again, further reducing our overall impact on the environment, making us more efficient overall. So a lot of changes in adoption there. As I mentioned, the furrow irrigated rice, the rapid adoption has been impressive. Rice doesn't require flood. It is a semi-aquatic plant. we need to avoid moisture stress or moisture deficit stress, but we don't have to have a flood to achieve that. A lot of our growers are seeing that it's easier to rotate with other crops, saving on land management and tillage costs, and we're not constructing and removing levees, which are required for us to maintain floods. And again, the question about reduction of water use, very situational. Most often, it's certainly no more water use compared to a flooded environment, and it can be a reduction in those situations. Alternate wetting and drying is still small adoption for us. That was just beginning to gain some notoriety about the time that irrigated rice took off, more in the Mid-South. So to a certain degree, the AWD has gone a little bit to the back burner. Can be, again, this one in particular can be substantial water savings, but where water can't be managed extremely well, then it can be a risky decision for a grower to attempt that. And alternate wetting and drying, I guess, for better explanation, is where we're going to a flood, but then not pumping any water and allowing the flood to naturally subside. And essentially, once it goes back to a muddy state without necessarily any standing water, then we raise the flood back up. And it allows growers the opportunity to capture more rainfall events and things like that, rather than trying to maintain a constant deep flood on the rice. Multiple inlet rice irrigation, as I mentioned, with the visual here, able to see actual poly tubing down the side of a field and crossing levees with water being put in each individual paddy. You can still see the spills or gates out there, but those are actually set very high just to be an emergency overflow should too much rainfall or something occur. So definitely something, again, that's practiced on about a third of our acreage with substantial water savings. A few other practices that we really refer to as some of our sustainability efforts is a very heavy emphasis on soil fertility and soil testing. For us, that's primarily focusing on phosphorus, potassium, and zinc fertility for rice. The nitrogen soil test for rice, which was developed by some of our fertility researchers, referred to as NSTAR, is the first of its kind, where we're able to take soil samples from fields and give a field-specific prescription nitrogen fertilizer recommendation for that field. Again, that's shown in a lot of instances to change, in some cases very dramatically, the nitrogen rate recommendation for a given field. So that's been an interesting change. Some fields need more to maximize production, but a surprising number of those fields need quite a bit less nitrogen. The Green Seeker handheld, which is based on the normalized NDVI, normalized difference vegetative index, to look at mid-season nitrogen management and whether or not we need to add nitrogen at mid-season to maximize yield. Focus on cover crops for our rotational efforts, minimizing erosion, minimizing our need for other inputs and additional herbicide applications. Seed treatments have allowed us to use less seed, reduce the impact of soil-borne fungi and soil insect pests on the crop, and minimize the need for spraying foliar pesticides. And then treatment thresholds for insects and disease have been a focus that have allowed similar efforts for us as well. From an export market standpoint, from the Mid-South, and again, Arkansas responsible for 48 to 50% of Mid-South rice production on an annual basis, with Mexico, Haiti, Central America, Canada, Colombia, the UK, Venezuela, Iraq, Taiwan, and Saudi Arabia being the major markets for the Mid-South U.S. crop. We've had a lot of effort over the past, in particular, 30 years, I'll say, as our rice breeding programs have certainly been going on for much longer than that. But over that time, we've continually increased efforts to meet the quality demands in the varieties that are being released out of the Mid-South breeding programs, which includes that of the University of Arkansas. And there's even a further effort, again, not just us, but our breeding counterparts, both private industry and other universities such as Louisiana State University, to focus even more on releasing additional varieties to meet specific market demand and continuing to further improve quality, whether that be, preferred length width ratio, amylose content for stickiness, the degree of chalk, things like that. Those are all have been a focus of those programs, and those continue to be even increasing in focus as we move forward here at this time. So I'd like to thank you once again for allowing me to have a few minutes of your time, and I'll be happy to take any questions at this point.
Thank you, Dr. Hardke, for your very interesting and informative presentation. And now I would like to move on to questions from our participants. Currently, we have a few open questions which are more targeted to the other panelists. So I would like to keep those for the end of the webinar. I have an Arkansas related question. As you have mentioned, the acreage in Arkansas is up by 26% and yield is up as well. So does this mean substantially higher supply for the marketing year 2020, 2021?
That's what it looks like at this point, particularly when we're talking about long grain, because the largest increase for us in the state, what was in long grain, with a pretty good reduction in our medium grain acreage. So virtually all of that increase over the previous year was in long grain. So that supply should be very good, but at the same time, coming off of an extremely down year, there seems to be that perception that increase in supply may also go very quickly, as it is assisting in recovering from the sharp decline and decrease that we had last year.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Hardke. I will continue now with our last panelist for today, Dr. Bruce Linquist, Outreach and Education Specialist at the University of California in Davis. California is the second largest US rice producing state, and high quality Japonica rice varieties grown here are exported to several EU countries to be used, among others, for sushi or other Asian cuisines. Dr. Linquist's extension efforts focus on developing and improving nutrient management practices that improve nutrient use efficiency, are economical, and result in minimal offsite pollution. Dr. Linquist, thank you for being here with us today in spite of the substantial time difference. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Good morning or afternoon, wherever we're at. I'm going to share my screen here. Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to be talking about the rice report here for California. What I'm going to be doing is just covering an overview of the California rice production system. It's a bit unique compared to what we've just heard from in Arkansas, but I would say globally, it's a rather unique system. We'll talk a little bit about our rice exports and where California rice ends up. A little bit on the 2020 rice season and how that's shaped up, and then discuss some of the sustainability practices in California. This is just a diagram showing a cropping season of rice in California. We're here in November as we speak. I would say 99% of the fields are harvested as we speak. There's a few still remaining out there, but it's mostly harvested. In general, growers are working on their straw. There's some straw being baled, but a lot of it is being incorporated. It's going to be flooded, and they're getting ready for the waterfowl season where straw is decomposed. We start a little later than they do in the Mid-South US. Typically in March, ground operations start. We're planting usually in late April and into May, and then harvesting beginning at really kind of mid-September through mid-November is our harvest period. So Again, a growing season of April through October, about 150 days, typically planting to harvest. It's a water seeded system. I'm not sure if you can see in this, and this is what makes California a bit unique. There are water seeded systems in the Mid-South, in Australia, maybe even in parts of Europe. But here the field is flooded before planting. And then the seed is aerially flown onto the fields, and the fields remain largely flooded until they're drained in preparation for harvest. California is also largely a medium grain producer. There is some short and long grain produced, but that's a relatively small portion of the market. California has very high rice yields. It's the highest in the US, and probably rivals Australia, where Australia probably has the highest yields globally. California falls a little bit behind that. And California is a very regulated system, and that has led to some of the sustainability practices that we'll be talking about. It's much more regulated than some of the other states in the US. And all rice is non-GMO. So again, just touching on some of the areas that we've already just discussed. Grain types, about 90% are medium grain. The rest being some of these other types. California really focuses on a high quality medium grain rice. I've worked in many countries around the world and in various rice growing areas. And I would say I've not seen the emphasis on quality that California puts on its rice. It's really remarkable, and they've maintained a very high quality rice. In terms of organic rice production, about 5%. It's not insignificant. There's quite a bit of organic rice, and so 5% is grown. Lundberg's is a big one, but there are many other organic rice producers. Already mentioned yields. On average, we're about 8,500 pounds an acre, about 9.5 metric tons per hectare. And you can say that's been fairly steady over the last decade. We have seen a slight increase over the last two decades. So very high yields. Our high was in 2015, where we almost reached 10 metric tons per hectare. So Jarrod already covered this partially. You can see where Arkansas and the Mid-South area, where they're growing roughly 80% of the rice here. California is on average around 20% of the rice production. It's typically about the second largest rice producing state in the US. And on average, there's about 500,000 acres, or about 200,000 hectares of rice grown in California. You can see over here how it varies from year to year. Unlike the Mid-South, where it might vary due to other crops, California is most growers are growing only rice, and there's not a lot of rotation. So variation in area is typically driven by water availability, droughts, in some cases too much rain during the planting period. We have a very narrow planting window. If we're too late, we're not going to plant. It just gets too cold. So we have a narrow planting window. So too much rain in the planting period can reduce acreage. But in most cases, it's often the case where in drought years, you might see lower acreage. Looking at our export markets, typically about 50% is for domestic use, 25 going to Japan, 12% to Korea, EU about 7.5, or about 10 between Canada, EU, Turkey, Middle East. These are the actual 2019 numbers, which typically reflect what a normal year, where Japan and South Korea are major export markets, but there's also quite a bit going to Middle East and the EU. So I just wanted to touch a little bit on the 2020 season. Overall, I think COVID had a relatively small impact on rice production in California. The biggest thing that we saw was probably a shortage of nitrogen early in the season. California rice farmers with their system, aqua ammonia, it's a liquid, is the primary nitrogen source for California rice growers. And there was supply issues early on, which delayed fertilization and planting by a little bit. That wasn't a big concern, the delay. We had a relatively dry spring, so there wasn't a huge issue with that small delay. Rice area, a little higher than we've seen, about 513,000 acres or 208,000 hectares. And we were about 17% of the rice area in this last year. Oops, sorry. The harvest was very dry, which was very good in the sense that a lot of times growers are rushing to get things in before fall rain. We don't get much rain, as I'll show you later during the growing season, but we do start to get rain in the fall. And sometimes fall rain interrupts harvest. We didn't get any rain during this last fall. And we're guessing, based on what we're seeing so far, that yields are going to be fairly average at about 9.5 ton per hectare. That's metric tons. Milling quality. Our quality is largely affected by moisture, humidity during the harvest period. We had 2 periods of very hot, dry winds, which really dry out the grain. And these were followed by periods of cool mornings where there was a lot of dew. So there was a lot of drying and rehydration of the grain. And rice that was harvested during these narrow windows, we're expecting that milling quality will be down in those areas. When you're outside those windows, we've seen fairly typical milling quality, which is very good. I did mention the dry fall, which was favorable, but it also, certainly there was a lot of wildfires and smoke during the latter part of the season. And you can see that here in this graph, where we're looking at 3 different weather stations, and this is solar radiation. And you can see I put a dark line in here, whereas a typical year, it was actually last year. And you can see in these areas where solar radiation during the day sometimes drop to 1/3 of what we would normally expect. We had a thought this all occurred during where we would see the grain fill and ripening period in rice. And we had thought that this might have a negative impact on yield. We weren't sure what kind of effect it would have on quality. However, what we're seeing so far is it doesn't, I mean, our yields, I think, are going to be average. Maybe without the smoke, they would have been a lot higher. But generally, we're not seeing an overly large effect of those fires and the smoke and lack of solar radiation on either yield or grain quality, which is good news for us. I'd like to shift a bit the last half of my talk to sustainability practices. I'm going to be touching on a number of them as we go through here. The first is air quality, and air quality comes in a different different areas of air quality, but certainly a lot of our herbicides are flown on. And you can see here herbicides being flown on and the potential for drift. And drift can end up harming neighboring crops or getting, there's into urban areas. So there's a shift to more granular herbicides where there's less drift. There's a lot of restrictions related to wind on applying any kind of herbicides. No fly zones. This might be around urban areas or other crops that may be affected by those pesticides that are being flown in. And then we're seeing an increased use of in-field applicators. Here's an example of one. It's called a steel wheel tractor, where you're able to get the nozzles a lot closer to the crop canopy, and it really reduces drift. So that has been increasing, and it gives growers flexibility in the timing of their pesticide applications. The other thing that I'll be discussing a little bit later is restrictions of burning straw in the winter. Obviously, there's a lot of straw out there. Historically, it was burned, but then that was phased out. Typically, now only about 10 to 12% of the straw is burned, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Water quality is another big issue. Again, relative to pesticide applications. Just about all pesticides will have what we call a hold time. This is a period after a pesticide has been applied where water can't be released from the field. So it's boarded up. There's usually even plastic and mud being applied at all of the outlets. And then the grower cannot release any water from that field until the required hold time is up. And the hold times are based on degradation curves that are done for each pesticide to see at what point is the pesticide, the molecule, at low enough levels where it's not going to be a risk to the environment. So hold times will generally range from anywhere from a couple days to up to 28 days, depending on the pesticide. And again, as mentioned earlier, just increased use of granular herbicides. Again, drift can get into nearby water canals, affecting water quality right outside of the field. The other thing is monitoring of nitrate in groundwater. And so there are 8 monitoring wells throughout the Sacramento Valley where most of the rice is grown in California, monitoring for nitrate. Nitrate, we don't really expect to be a problem based on chemistry and flooded systems. We know that not a lot of it is getting leached. There's a high likelihood of it actually going denitrifying and leaving as N2 gas instead. But generally, the monitoring wells are showing very low levels of nitrate, but they are monitored throughout the season. Just following up on nitrogen management, again, all farmers in California are required to develop farm level nitrogen management plans, how much nitrogen they're putting on. They have to have not with rice because of the monitoring wells, but some other farmers they're responsible for how much nitrogen is leaving their field in water. But the California rice system has developed a system where it's primarily based on the monitoring of these wells. And as Jarrod mentioned, in Arkansas, there's more use of decision aids in determining when fertilizer nitrogen use is needed through NDVI measurements and other types of tools. Water use is a big issue in California. It drives a lot of our acreage on an annual basis. We don't get any rainfall, or very little rainfall in the summer. It would be measured in millimeters how much we would get in any given growing season. So all of the water use, or the large portion of water used in California is based on stored water from snowmelt that occurs during the winter along the Sierra Nevada, which fall on the eastern side of the Sacramento Valley and San Joaquin valleys here. So a lot of reservoirs up there, and water is diverted into supply canals. And so most of the water being used in California is surface water from the snow melt. About 5% might be irrigated with pumps. So very low level of that. And what we're seeing, there's actually regulation for it as well, is increased requirements on field level monitoring of water use at the field level. It might look something like this in this picture here, where you have a micrometer, flow meter coming into the field, and it's being monitored there. So it's not very common, but it's increasing, this monitoring. Talked a lot about straw management. I would say this is one of the biggest issues that it's really a positive story that has occurred over the past couple of decades. Right now, you can see that prior to 1990, about 95% of the rice straw was burned. We started phasing in during this decade here from 1990 to 2000, phased in enforcement of banning of rice straw. And so you can see as rice straw declined, incorporation of the straw has increased, and incorporation along with flooding the rice fields to decompose rice straw. It's very important that that rice straw is decomposed. It causes a lot of problems if it's not in the following season. So most of the acreage, about 80 to 90% in any given year, is incorporated, and a lot of that is intentionally flooded. Some of it gets flooded in higher rainfall years. About 8 to 12% are burned, and you do need permits for that. They're limited, and they're based on particulate matter in the air, if you can burn or not. I don't know, about 5 to 10% of straw is baled. I would say this is increasing. We're seeing more straw being baled for various reasons, either for using it as livestock industry, but also very recently, a large fiberboard plant has just been built in the rice area that is using straw to make high quality fiberboard. The benefits of straw management are clearly related to air quality, and that's been documented well. But the other thing is wildlife, waterfowl habitat. This is just some pictures of how rice straw is managed. It can be chopped, or it can be, they call this stomping, where standing straw is just rolled into this thing. But generally it gets flooded, and we have a lot of habitat. Over 12 million waterfowl use California rice lands, but it's also, those are migrating waterfowl. There's a lot of other shorebirds that come in from the coast that use it throughout the year. And there's numerous waterfowl programs working with the rice industry to develop this habitat. And with that, I'd like to thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Linquist, for this very interesting presentation. And I would like to open up here the discussion for all our panelists. But before doing so, I would like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Steve Linscomb, who is the Executive Director of the Rice Foundation and Coordinator of the Rice Leadership Development Program. Prior to joining USA Rice, he spent many years at the Louisiana State University Egg Center as the senior rice breeder, and later also as the director of the Rice Research Station. During his tenure, his program released 34 improved rice varieties. So now I kindly ask all our panelists to turn on your cameras, please. And I would like to start answering all the questions which were coming in during the webinar. So let me direct the first one to Dr. Linquist. This is related to California. It's from Christoph Bertschi from RISO, the Swiss Rice Federation, and Stützer and Co. AG in Switzerland. How is the rice industry in California coping with the combination of wildfires and COVID-19?
Yeah, we haven't seen a large impact on that. Again, much of this is in the field. So work in the field really did not get halted. I mentioned that there were some supply chain issues early on with nitrogen fertilizer. And that wasn't a big issue. And again, the fires, we did not see, we thought that it might have a fairly, some negative impact, but we have not seen, we have not seen that. What it has done, related to straw burning, typically in the fall right now, you would see some rice fields getting permits to burn rice straw. That's not happening. They're really keeping air quality. There's already particulate matter in the air. So there is a reduction this year probably in the amount of acreage that could be burned because of the wildfires.
Thank you very much, Dr. Linquist. Turning on to the next question from Jonathan Callan from the UK. And I would like to direct this to Dr. Goldberg. Mutual recognition of standards and better coordination between the authorities is something we should perhaps be trying to encourage through dialogue with other crop sectors who may be facing similar challenges. Any thoughts on the scope for better cooperation? Dr. Goldberg.
All right. Well, thank you for the question. And I believe your question also refers to a editorial comment about Codex. We understand that Codex is certainly not the end all and be all of international standards harmonization, but it is a mechanism that many countries use, including the United States, including the European Union. It is a science-based approach to regulation of not only pesticides, but other aspects of the food industry. Regardless of the fact that it is, as you suggested, weak, part of that is that the standards that Codex develops are really guidance. It's not technically a standard. It's not enforceable standards. They are non-binding binding guidelines for countries to use at their discretion. Certainly, there are opportunities within trade discussions for mutual recognition of our various approaches to scientific standards. There are opportunities for international harmonization of these standards, whether it's through Codex or in bilateral discussions. We certainly believe that such an approach is valuable, so long as the approach is based on the best available science and that it is a risk assessment type approach, particularly as it relates to products such as pesticides.
Thank you very much, Dr. Goldberg. Continuing with the next question, and I would like to ask Betsy to answer this one. Is the pandemic increasing the demand for US rice in international markets? And if so, which markets? The question from Robin Rominger.
Okay, thanks, Esther. Well, I guess if you listen to Nathan's presentation, you know that we're projecting increased exports this year. I think some of it is related to weather situations in South America. Brazil in particular has come into the market in a pretty big way when they haven't been in the past. But we do see demand increasing in Central America for rice. And I would also mention another category, which is food aid. So we supply a significant amount of milled rice into the US government food aid programs, and we do see increased demand there. We've already shipped more rice for food aid this year than we did the entire year last year. So that is a growing area for us. And I would say, the pandemic in the United States, the impact on rice demand was very interesting. We saw a drop off, obviously, in food service demand when restaurants shut down in March, and many of them are still shut down around the country. But we saw a huge spike in retail demand for U.S. rice, and so that's been a really challenging. It was challenging for March and April logistically for the mills to kind of meet that demand. But I think we've achieved an equilibrium. But we do see demand and consumption increasing both here and internationally. And Nathan, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but.
Nathan, you're muted. Please unmute.
Thank you. Right, the U.S. exports are expected to increase. Remember, the U.S. was supply constrained in 1920. The long grain essentially ran out of rice, and then the U.S. has weather issues, tight supplies in that southern South American region. It is true in that March period of 2020, there were export restrictions, export quotas in Southeast Asia, not the United States didn't. Then India had a lockdown, Pakistan had a lockdown. India's moving off that lockdown. Now, remember though, the US doesn't compete with India or Thailand or Vietnam in a lot of markets. The US big markets are the Western Hemisphere. I did forget to note that the food aid shipments reported by the Kansas City Commodity Office are way up from a year ago. That's public information. They're essentially announced on a monthly basis, sort of, by June, July, August. They're much higher than they were a year ago. And we're early in the year. We're probably barely around a third into the market year, we're well less than half. And they're already well exceed what they did for the previous 12 months. That's going to be heavily West Africa. That's a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, very heavily West Africa. Also, as you realize, the United States commercial shipments to sub-Saharan Africa are rather weak. The United States sells a high quality, high price. So US exports are up. Weather was a factor. The tight supply situation. The global market is picking up from the pandemic. The decline in trade in 2020 wasn't huge, but it was somewhat, and it did drop. It boosted prices. So for the U.S., it's the fact that the U.S. now has large supplies, much bigger crop. Its competitors are in South America. They're running out of rice. So and the food aid, that's an important factor. I did not mention it because it had been so weak. In 1920, food aid was quite small, but already it's exceeded. It's still a small share. The bulk of U.S. exports are commercial, the bulk, but food aid is up, and we're only a third of the way in the year. Hope that helped.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chais, and thank you, Betsy. I will continue with the next two questions as they both relate to the same topic from Caroline Flecklin and Benjamin Savage. The question is, the EU has changed the regulation for chlorate. So what you can do for the next crop to have this regulation of 0.0105 milligram per kilogram, how can you comply? And I would like to direct this question to Dr. Goldberg.
All right. Well, thank you, Esther. The United States is certainly aware that the European Commission has imposed a new MRL for chlorate at 0.05 ppm. We believe that was done in June. When we look at chlorate, the use in the United States as it relates to rice, it's typically used as a desiccant, although not very many producers use it. The US first registered sodium chlorate for use on food crops in 1966. In fact, the registration was issued shortly around the day of my birth in 1966, which might explain why people describe me as somewhat salty. Nevertheless, EPA has reevaluated the product as recently as 2008. In that reevaluation, they looked at how it was being used, where it was being used, and determined that at the levels it was being used, the residues were well below the level of concern and therefore exempted the product from the need for a tolerance in the United States. Recognizing that the European Union has imposed this new MRL, we are certainly in the process of determining where it's being used in the United States and whether or not the tolerance level established, the MRL established, in the European Union will be an issue of concern. So right now we are doing that evaluation. We hope to certainly be able to identify where it may be a concern, where it's not a concern, and take the appropriate action to make sure that all the product exported to the European Union meets the new MRL requirement.
Thank you, Dr. Goldberg. Now I would like to turn to the next question, and I would like to direct this to Dr. Linquist, as it is concerning California. Which California rice varieties are increasing and why?
Most of all of our varieties, 80%, 90% of our varieties are medium grain varieties. We're seeing a shift to slightly longer duration varieties. M206 is 50% of our medium grain acreage. It is a fairly short duration variety. We are seeing shifts to slightly longer duration varieties. Some of these varieties have a little bit of blast resistance, which is important in certain areas. And they're higher yielding. We have a new variety, M211. It's a little longer, but it's very close to being a premium quality variety. So it's very high quality, high yields, but it is slightly bit longer. There are a lot of other varieties, long grain, short grain, but they remain a small percent of the market.
Thank you very much, Dr. Linquist, for your answer. I would like to continue with the next question and direct this to Dr. Hardke. This is again related to the chlorates. The EU has recently introduced an MRL for chlorates in rice. I believe chlorates are used as a desiccant in Arkansas. How has the rice industry in Arkansas managed chlorates this season to ensure that rice from this harvest meets the new EU MRL?
So thank you for the question. At this point in time, the level of detection from any use of a sodium chlorate application is not known to us to exceed that new MRL. So really the use of those products for us has continued. The state of Arkansas, we would estimate somewhere around a third of our acreage annually, dependent upon production conditions. It is, when we describe it as a desiccant, we more accurately term it as a harvest aid. So there are certain years where environmental conditions lead us to use it to those degrees, and certain years where we do not. So again, it is still just one small tool that we use, and the vast majority of our rice production does not use that product in the first place. But we have not observed that we have exceeded that MRL.
Thank you, Dr. Hardke. Now continuing with the next question. The experience of European farmers is that water use is detrimental in the presence of heavy metals. Does the Californian flooding method raise any challenges in terms of arsenic levels? And I would like to direct to Dr. Linquist, please.
Yeah, I think in all cases, a flooded system is going to affect heavy metal uptake. And globally, you'll see that arsenic is typically higher in flooded systems. You would think that in California, where our fields are flooded for a longer period than they are in the Mid-South, they're flooded pretty much for the whole season, that you would think that would lead to higher arsenic levels in California rice. It does not. Generally in California, we see lower arsenic levels than you do see in other parts of the US. That may be related to the amount of arsenic present in the soil. It may be related a little bit to varieties used. But arsenic levels in California are real. We don't see that as a big concern. It's usually below the limits that are required.
Thank you very much, Dr. Linquist. Now continuing with the next question from Christoph Birchie, and I would like to ask Dr. Childs to answer this one. Why did China build up these large rice stocks, and what will they do with those quantities?
Well, okay, thank you. It's a very good question. China, I showed a chart earlier. China built up stocks huge in the late 20th century, realized they had too much rice, and then policies were designed to reduce production to draw the stocks down. But the stocks have been rising. That's old news. There may be a lot of reasons. One is just it's food security. That's a lot of rice in stock, that if anything happened to a crop, there's a lot of rice that could be distributed. So there's a lot of food security. That's the imports, of course, could be how the quality of that rice. You know, some of that rice has been in stocks quite a while. The imported rice may be higher quality. China is moving that rice into the global market at very low prices. The rice that Puerto Rico buys, milled basis, is probably equivalent to a rough rice price in the U.S. It's a very low price. It's discounted. I'd say that the stocks, what would happen in the global market if a lot of that rice may not be of quality enough, it's already going into the global market. Feed use is a major possibility. It could go for feed use, domestic. They wouldn't export it for feed use, but it could. That could change feed markets. So and there's an article ERS published about 1.5 years ago looking at the potential if China released maybe 10 million tons. It was just a hypothetical how it would affect feed grain prices, and not a lot, but local level. Feed, by the way, the growth in China's consumption is mostly non-food. It's going to be feed, ethanol, and other industrial. So food security, that would be one. It's just insurance in case of a bad crop. On the global market, already rice is moving. The Puerto Rico business that's all out of government stocks, selling it at probably half the market price, and you can determine the price that's reported in the different trade sources that publicly report that. I would say food security. China was pulling its area down. It realized that it had too much rice. The area went back up this year, and they wanted more of that early indica crop, which actually is a low quality and probably used in feed. So probably feed use and industrial uses, and just to watch any impact on the global market. Again, an ERS article looked at what would happen if maybe 10 million tons were reduced for feed use. China is one of the only countries of the world that uses rice much for feed. Rice isn't used a lot globally for feed. It's mostly for food. It's heavily used for food. It's mostly a food grain. Huge stocks overhang the global market. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Childs. And actually a follow-up question to that also concerning China. Is there now confidence in Chinese reports on stock sizes, which was doubted in the past?
Well, right. Their stock number, of course, is a derived number. Production is reported by the government of China. And we take that number, it's publicly released. Trade data is developed. Not all, there's informal trade, of course. Within the production numbers, normally NBS reports area, production, yield by crop. Often can get it by province. As far as stocks, it is derived. The WASDE website explains it includes rice that could go, government-held stocks, rice, farmer-held stocks that could go into markets. It's not a number like in the United States where NASS surveys. It's not. That's NASS surveys and release the stocks numbers. It breaks it down by different, whether it's on farm, off farm, barge, by state. It's derived. Whatever it is, China's holding huge stocks of rice. And remember, their exports, that export data, bulk of that's often reported. Their private sources that provide. You can determine price, you determine the revenue, the quantity, you can develop the price. The stocks number is derived. Again, their government reports a production number, again, by crop. There's early indica, late indica, the single season crop. again, trade numbers, most of the trade is local. Look at, from Southeast Asia, Pakistan, look at export to data. There is trade around Burma, Cambodia, that could be not as well, some of it's not as well documented, but fully close. I agree on the stocks number. It is derived. It is not a hard number that's reported like with NAS. I hope that answers some of your questions. By the way, China is the largest consumer and producer of rice in the world. So it's a big one to look at.
Thank you very much, Dr. Childs. That was a very good information. And now I would like to come to our last question and direct this to you, Dr. Linscomb. Is there any prospect for new aromatic varieties for domestic production in the US to compete with increasing imports from Thailand and India?
So the short answer is yes. Most of the southern rice breeding programs, as well as the California program, is working on aromatics. Most of that work is focused on jasmine types, which is a long grain that is softer cooking because of amylose and gel temp characteristics. And my former program at Louisiana State University has released 3 jasmine types. Arkansas has released 1, and California has released 1 in the last few years. And the acreage devoted to those types continues to increase. And I think we're going to start being pretty competitive. These varieties are very similar to the imported Thai and Vietnamese jasmine types. And I think we're going to become more and more competitive in those markets.
Thank you very much, Dr. Linscomb. Thank you for this great interaction and the lot of great questions. I would like to conclude today's webinar. Dear colleagues, dear members of the UK, EU, Swiss rice industry, our members, FAS Post and US rice enthusiasts all over Europe, thank you very much for your participation here today and your interest in the US rice industry. We hope that you have gained useful information about the US rice crop that may increase your interest in importing US rice. In case you would like to connect directly with US rice suppliers or have any questions about US rice, please do not hesitate to contact me. We will put my contact information in the chat function and include this information in our follow-up email as well. As you have heard during the presentations today, the US rice crop is grown, milled, and further processed under stringent regulations for food safety and quality. In addition, the US rice industry is committed to the highest standards of environmental preservation and sustainability. The entire US rice industry looks forward to continue working together with many of our long-lasting business partners in the region and also to establish new business relations. Thank you very much for your participation today. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.